I grew up in a quiet town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and life revolved around small traditions and familiar faces. My wife, Sarah, and I had been together since high school. She was my best friend long before she became my partner. We married young, built a life together, and had our daughter, Mia, in 2006. For years, we were the picture of stability, or at least I thought we were. Looking back, the signs were there, though I didn't see them for what they were. Sarah had always been ambitious, a dreamer who wanted more than what our small town could offer. I loved that about her, her drive, her determination, but as the years went on, I started to notice her energy shifting. She became distant, distracted, always on her phone or finding excuses to stay late at work. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Who doesn't have rough patches in a marriage, right? But then, little things started to eat away at me. The way she'd suddenly brighten up at a notification on her phone. The vague answers when I asked her what was on her mind. And the one that hurt the most, how she seemed less interested in us. The warmth we used to share felt like it was slipping away, and I couldn't figure out why. At the time, I was working at the local mill, Maplewood Manufacturing, where I'd been since I was 19. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave me a sense of purpose. Sarah, on the other hand, worked as an administrative manager at a growing tech firm in the city, a job that brought her into contact with people who lived a very different life from ours. That was where she met him. I didn't know it at the time, but meeting Andrew, a charming, successful executive from her company, was the beginning of the end for us. I didn't want to admit something was wrong at first. For a long time, I convinced myself I was overthinking things. Sarah and I had been together for so long, through so much, teenage heartbreaks, college stresses, our daughter's birth, I thought we were unshakable. But the cracks in our foundation started to show, no matter how hard I tried to ignore them. The first real wake-up call came one evening when Sarah came home later than usual. It wasn't unusual for her to stay late at work, her job was demanding, and she always took her career seriously. But this time was different. She walked through the door, looking flustered. Her hair was a mess, her makeup smudged, and she smelled of cologne that wasn't mine. I asked if she was okay, and she brushed me off with a quick, "Just a rough day at work," before disappearing into the bathroom. I stood there for a moment, feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. Something was off, but I didn't have the courage to press her. Maybe I was scared of what I'd find if I dug too deep. Over the next few weeks, her behavior only became more suspicious. She was on her phone constantly, and she'd tilt the screen away from me if I walked by. There were late nights that became more frequent, and vague excuses about client meetings or last-minute projects. Once, I caught her smiling at a text message, a kind of smile I hadn't seen in years, and when I asked who it was, she laughed nervously and said, "Oh, just a work thing." That's when I started paying closer attention. One night, after she fell asleep, I picked up her phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it. I knew her passcode because we'd always shared that kind of thing, but this felt different. I felt like I was violating her trust, even though part of me already knew she'd broken mine. At first, I didn't find anything. Her texts and emails were clean. Too clean. That's when it hit me, she might have been using one of those encrypted messaging apps. I checked her downloads and saw an app one didn't recognize, something innocuous looking called Signal. I opened it, and there it was, a thread of messages with someone named A. It didn't take long to piece it together. The messages were full of inside jokes, flirty comments, and late night, "I can't stop thinking about you," texts. My stomach churned as I scrolled further and found photos, selfies of Sarah with that warm, glowing smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years, and pictures of A. Andrew. I recognized him from a work event Sarah had dragged me to last year. Tall, confident, with a perfect smile and the kind of charisma that filled a room. He looked like someone who got what he wanted, and it was clear from the messages that what he wanted was my wife. I felt sick. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, scream, do anything to release the boiling anger inside me. But I didn't. Instead, I put the phone back where I found it and went downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at nothing, trying to figure out what to do. A part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, wake her up and demand an explanation. But another part of me, maybe the cowardly part, wanted to pretend I hadn't seen anything. Maybe it wasn't as bad as it looked. Maybe it was just flirting, some kind of stupid, meaningless distraction. But deep down, I knew better. You don't send messages like that if it's meaningless. You don't smile at your phone like that for just anyone. I barely slept that night. When morning came, I couldn't even look at her. She noticed, of course. "What's wrong?" she asked as I poured my coffee, her tone laced with feigned concern. I wanted to blurt it out, throw the truth in her face, but the words wouldn't come. I just shook my head and muttered, "Nothing. I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. My world had just started to fall apart, and I knew there was no going back. The next few days felt like a slow-motion car crash. I couldn't shake the images from her phone, those messages, the pictures, the lies. Every time she looked at me, I felt like I was suffocating. I couldn't pretend anymore, couldn't hold it in. Something had to give. It felt like I was waiting for the right moment, but there was never a right time. The tension was unbearable, like a storm waiting to break. That evening, after Mia had gone to bed, I finally decided I couldn't wait any longer. I told Sarah we needed to talk. Her face dropped immediately, and I saw that familiar nervous look in her eyes, the same one she'd had when she knew she was about to get caught. She tried to brush it off, asking if I was just stressed, maybe overthinking things again. But I could see the guilt written all over her face. "You know what's going on," I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind inside me. "I know about Andrew." Her eyes widened, but she didn't deny it. Not immediately, anyway. She froze, then glanced down at her hands. For a moment, I thought she might cry, but instead, she took a deep breath and looked back at me. "Roger, she trailed off, her words stuck in her throat. She seemed like she was trying to find the right words, the right excuse, but nothing came. Her silence was deafening. Finally, she spoke, but it wasn't what I expected. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. It just did." Her eyes were avoiding mine, her gaze fixed on the floor. There was no apology, no real remorse in her voice, just a resigned explanation, like she knew she couldn't take it back, but wanted to justify it anyway. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I was paralyzed by the betrayal. I had so many questions, but they all seemed irrelevant. What did it matter why it happened? What mattered was that it did. "So, you've been seeing him behind my back," I said, my words sharp and heavy, slicing through the silence. "And you didn't think to tell me? You didn't think I deserved to know?" She shook her head, eyes brimming with tears now. "I didn't want to hurt you, Roger. I never meant for this to go this far. It was just complicated. I don't know how it happened, but it did." I felt a rush of anger flood through me. I wanted to hit something, anything. The way she spoke, so casually, as if what she did could somehow be explained away by a few words. She thought she could soften the blow with her tears, with her complicated excuse. But none of that mattered to me. I couldn't just let her off the hook with vague apologies and weak explanations. "You're right," I said, my voice a tight, trembling whisper. "It is complicated. But what's really complicated is why you couldn't just talk to me. Why didn't you come to me? We've been together for years, Sarah. You really think I would have let you go through something like this alone?" She didn't respond. There was nothing she could say. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my emotions swirling around like a storm, but I couldn't find the words to express all the hurt and anger that had built up inside me. Finally, Sarah wiped her eyes and looked up at me, her voice breaking. "Roger, I'm so sorry. I messed up. But it's not what you think. Andrew, he's just someone I've connected with. I'm not saying it makes it right, but it wasn't about you. It was about me." The more she spoke, the less sense it made. I had no idea what she was trying to say. Was she blaming me? Trying to justify the affair? Did she even know what she was asking for at this point? I couldn't stay in that room any longer. Every word she said made me feel smaller, weaker, like I was losing myself in her lies. I stood up and walked out, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Sarah tried to stop me, calling my name, but I just kept walking. I couldn't breathe in that house anymore. I spent the night at a friend's place, not knowing what to do. I couldn't even look at myself in the mirror. My mind was in a whirlwind, replaying everything Sarah had said, every moment I'd missed, every red flag that I hadn't picked up on. I couldn't understand why she'd done this. Was I not enough? Was our marriage not enough? By morning, I knew one thing for sure, this wasn't something I could just forget. No matter how many times she apologized, I wasn't sure I could ever trust her again. That night, as I lay on the couch at my friend Chris's place, the weight of everything hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just anger or betrayal I felt, it was deeper than that. It was like someone had reached inside my chest, ripped out my heart, and left a hollow, aching space where it used to be. I stared at the ceiling for hours, replaying every moment with Sarah in my head, trying to pinpoint when it all went wrong. Was it my fault? Had I failed her somehow? I kept cycling through the same questions, even though I knew I might never get answers. I thought about our daughter, Mia, and how she had no idea her world was about to be turned upside down. How was I supposed to explain this to her? What could I say that wouldn't make her feel like her family was crumbling beneath her feet? The anger came in waves. One minute, I'd be devastated, drowning in the weight of what Sarah had done, and the next, I'd feel the kind of rage I'd never known I was capable of. How could she do this to me? To us? We'd built a life together, shared dreams, raised a daughter. Was that all just disposable to her? But then came the sadness, the suffocating grief that felt impossible to escape. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt, it was the loss of everything I thought we had. The Sarah I married, the life we built, the love I thought we shared, it felt like all of it had been shattered, leaving me to pick up the pieces alone. And the worst part? I still loved her. Even after everything, I couldn't just shut off the years of love and memories we'd shared. That was the part that hurt the most. Chris tried to talk to me, but I wasn't in the mood for advice or comfort. He said all the things a good friend is supposed to say: "You don't deserve this, you'll get through it, she's the one who messed up." I nodded along, but his words felt empty. None of it made me feel better because none of it changed the reality I was living in. By the second night, the emotional exhaustion began to set in. I hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, and my mind was running on fumes. I started to wonder if I even had the energy to fight anymore. Maybe it would be easier to let her go, to let Andrew have her and just move on. But then I thought about Mia again, and the thought of losing my family felt unbearable. The pain was relentless. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah's face, not the Sarah from the texts, but the Sarah I married. I remembered the way she used to look at me, the way she used to laugh at my stupid jokes, the way she held my hand when we brought Mia home from the hospital for the first time. Those memories felt like a cruel joke now, reminders of what I'd lost and what I might never get back. The hardest part was realizing that my life would never be the same. No matter what happened next, whether we stayed together or went our separate ways, this wound would leave a scar. It wasn't something I could just forget or forgive overnight. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild with a few apologies and promises to do better. And honestly, I didn't even know if I wanted to try. By the third day, I knew I couldn't keep running from it. I couldn't hide at Chris's place forever, as much as I wanted to. I had to face Sarah again, had to figure out what came next. But the thought of sitting across from her, of hearing her try to justify what she'd done, made me sick to my stomach. The emotional roller coaster was unbearable. 1 minute, I felt strong enough to walk away, to leave her and never look back. The next, I was consumed by doubt, wondering if there was still something worth salvaging. I didn't have any answers, but I knew I couldn't keep going like this. I had to make a decision, one way or another. And so, with a heavy heart and more fear than I'd ever felt in my life, I packed my bag and headed back home. I didn't know what I was going to say or how she'd react, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding her. It was time to face the storm, no matter how much it hurt. The drive home felt longer than it should have, the silence in the car pressing down on me like a heavy weight. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, my thoughts racing as I rehearsed what I might say to Sarah. Part of me wanted to demand answers, while another part just wanted to shut down, pack my bags, and leave. I didn't even know what I was hoping for anymore. Closure. Reassurance. A miracle. When I pulled into the driveway, the house felt different. It wasn't just a home anymore, it was a battlefield, a place that now carried the weight of her betrayal. The lights were on in the living room, and I could see Sarah pacing through the window. She must have heard the car because she stopped abruptly and looked out. I saw her hesitation, her nervousness, as she stepped away from the window and disappeared from view. I walked inside, and there she was, standing in the hallway, arms crossed. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was messy, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed. For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of the Sarah I used to know, the one who cared, the one who would have done anything to make things right. But then the weight of what she'd done crashed over me again, and that image shattered. "Roger," she started, her voice soft and hesitant, like she was afraid of what I might say. I dropped my bag by the door and looked at her, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "We need to talk," I said, my voice low but firm. There was no yelling, no outburst, I didn't have the energy for that anymore. I was too tired, too drained to let my emotions take over. She nodded and gestured toward the couch, but I stayed standing. I couldn't bring myself to sit down, not when everything felt so unstable. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "About us. About what you did. And I need to know the truth, Sarah, all of it. No more half answers, no more excuses. If we're going to figure out what the hell happens next, I need you to be honest with me. Can you do that?" She swallowed hard, her hands fidgeting nervously. "I'll try," she said, her voice trembling. "But I need you to understand, Roger, it's not as simple as it seems. It's not just about—" "Stop," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "I don't want excuses, Sarah. I don't want to hear how complicated it is. I want the truth. Why did you do it? Was it worth it? Did you even think about Mia? About me?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might break down. But instead, she straightened her shoulders, as if trying to hold herself together. "I don't know why I did it," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was unhappy. I felt like we were stuck, like I was stuck. And then Andrew, he made me feel, noticed. Wanted. Like I mattered." Her words hit me like a slap in the face. "So, what? I didn't make you feel that way. Our life, our family, none of that made you feel like you mattered?" My voice cracked, the anger I'd been trying to hold back finally bubbling to the surface. "It's not that simple," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "I love you, Roger. I love our family. But I felt invisible. Like I was just going through the motions every day. Andrew, he gave me something I didn't even realize I was missing. Her words hurt more than I thought they would. It wasn't just the affair, it was the realization that she'd been unhappy, that I'd missed it, that I hadn't done enough to make her feel loved. But at the same time, I couldn't excuse what she'd done. I couldn't pretend that her reasons made it okay. "And what about me?" I asked, my voice quieter now, the anger giving way to exhaustion. "Do I even matter to you anymore? Or am I just convenient?" She shook her head quickly, her tears falling faster. "Of course, you matter, Roger. You always have. I know I screwed up, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I want to fix this. I want us to work through this, if you'll let me." Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could fix this, that our marriage wasn't beyond saving. But the truth was, I didn't know if I had it in me to try. The betrayal, the lies, it all felt too big, too overwhelming. "I don't know if I can," I said finally, my voice cracking. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Sarah. And without trust, what's the point?" She started to sob, her shoulders shaking as she tried to stifle the sound. I looked away, unable to watch her fall apart when I was barely holding myself together. "I need time," I said after a long silence. "I need space to figure out what I want. What I can handle. Right now, I don't have any answers." She nodded, her sobs quieting as she wiped her face. "I understand," she whispered. "Take whatever time you need. Just, please don't give up on us, Roger. Please." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked upstairs to the guest room, shutting the door behind me. The house was silent, except for the faint sound of Sarah crying downstairs. As I lay down on the unfamiliar bed, I felt a crushing weight settle over me. I was at a crossroads, but no matter which path I chose, I knew nothing would ever be the same. The next morning felt surreal. The house was eerily quiet, and for a moment, I could almost pretend that everything was normal. But then I heard Sarah moving around downstairs, her footsteps soft and hesitant, like she was trying not to disturb me. It reminded me of how careful we were around Mia when she was a baby, tiptoeing around to avoid waking her. Except now, the silence wasn't born of love, it was something heavier, something that made my chest ache. I stayed in the guest room for a while, staring at the ceiling and trying to muster the energy to face the day. My mind was a mess of conflicting emotions, anger, sadness, confusion. I wanted answers, but I wasn't sure if they would help or just make things worse. Part of me even felt guilty, like I was somehow to blame for all of this. Maybe if I'd been more attentive, more loving, Sarah wouldn't have felt the need to seek something from someone else. Eventually, I forced myself out of bed and went downstairs. Sarah was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee in her hands. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes red and puffy from crying. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension was suffocating. "I made coffee," she said quietly, gesturing toward the pot. Her voice was shaky, uncertain, like she didn't know how to talk to me anymore. I nodded but didn't move toward the coffee. "I'm not hungry," I said, my voice flat. I wasn't trying to be cold, but I didn't have the energy to pretend everything was okay. Sarah looked down at her hands, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her mug. "Roger. I know you're hurting. And I know I'm the reason for it. I don't expect you to forgive me overnight, but I need you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right." I let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsher than I intended. "Make it right?" I repeated. "How do you make right something like this, Sarah? You think a few apologies and promises are going to erase what you did?" Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I reminded myself that she'd made this bed, not me. "I don't know how to fix this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose our family. I sighed and leaned against the counter, running a hand through my hair. It's not just about losing me, Sarah. It's about what you've already lost. Trust. Respect. Those aren't things you can just snap your fingers and rebuild. She nodded slowly, her tears falling silently. I know. I know it's not going to be easy. But I'm willing to fight for us. Are you? Her question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I didn't know how to answer. Was I willing to fight for us? Did I even have the strength to try? I thought about Mia, about what this would mean for her. She deserved better than parents who were barely holding it together. But she also deserved the truth. I couldn't pretend this didn't happen. I couldn't fake happiness for her sake. I don't know, I said finally, my voice cracking under the weight of the words. I don't know if I can do this, Sarah. I don't know if I can look at you and not think about him. About what you did. She flinched at my words, like they physically hurt her. I'm sorry, she whispered. I know that's not enough, but I need you to know how much I regret this. How much I hate myself for hurting you. I shook my head, the anger bubbling up again. You regret it now because you got caught, Sarah. If I hadn't seen those messages, would you have told me? Or would you have kept sneaking around behind my back, pretending everything was fine? She didn't answer right away, and the silence was deafening. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes filled with shame. I don't know, she admitted. I don't know if I would have had the courage to tell you. And that's something I'll have to live with. Her honesty cut deeper than any lie ever could. I wanted to hate her, to yell at her, to make her feel the same pain she'd inflicted on me. But instead, I just felt empty. Like all the fight had been drained out of me. I need space, I said after a long pause. I need time to figure out what I want. And what I need. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I understand, she said softly. Take all the time you need. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, grabbing my coat and keys on the way. I didn't know where I was going, but I needed to get out of that house. I needed to breathe, to think, to clear my head. As I drove aimlessly through town, my thoughts kept circling back to the same question, was there anything left to fight for? Or was this the beginning of the end? I spent most of that day driving, circling through the familiar roads of our small town like they might somehow guide me toward clarity. The crisp autumn air seeped in through a crack in the car window, sharp and grounding. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't escape the weight of my thoughts. I felt untethered, like I was floating somewhere outside myself, watching my life unravel from a distance. By mid-afternoon, I found myself parked at a spot overlooking the lake. It was a place I hadn't been to in years, not since Mia was a toddler. Sarah and I used to come here when we first started dating, sitting on the hood of my old car, dreaming about a future we never imagined would end up like this. I stayed there for what felt like hours, staring at the water, my mind replaying every conversation, every memory, every mistake. I thought about Sarah's words, how she felt invisible, stuck, like she didn't matter. I hated that she'd felt that way, hated that I hadn't noticed. But I also hated the way she'd handled it, the way she'd turned to someone else instead of turning to me. Was I really so impossible to talk to? Had I been so blind to her unhappiness? As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the water in shades of gold and orange, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from Chris, checking in on me. Chris, hey man, you good? Wanna grab a drink? I stared at the screen for a moment, debating whether I wanted company or just more time to stew in my own thoughts. Eventually, I replied. Yeah. Meet me at Jack's in 30. Jack's was the local dive bar, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and no one asked too many questions. When I walked in, Chris was already at the bar, nursing a beer. He waved me over, his expression a mix of concern and cautious optimism. Rough day, he asked as I slid onto the stool next to him. I let out a bitter laugh. You could say that. Chris ordered me a beer, and for a while, we just sat there in silence. It was comforting, in a way, to not have to explain myself. Chris was the kind of friend who didn't push, who knew when to listen and when to let things breathe. After a while, though, he broke the silence. You want to talk about it? I stared at my beer, watching the condensation slide down the glass. Sarah cheated on me, I said bluntly. The words felt foreign in my mouth, like saying them out loud made them more real. Chris didn't say anything at first, just let the statement hang in the air. Finally, he let out a low whistle. Damn, man. I'm sorry. I didn't see that coming. Neither did I muttered, taking a long sip of my beer. It's like, everything I thought I knew about her, about us, just got flipped upside down. I don't even know who she is anymore. Chris nodded, his expression thoughtful. What are you gonna do? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I said, my voice heavy with sarcasm. I don't know, Chris. Part of me wants to just walk away, start over. But then I think about Mia, and I can't imagine not being there every day for her. And the other part of me. I don't know if I even have the strength to try and fix this. Chris was quiet for a moment before he spoke. Look, man, I'm not gonna tell you what to do. But whatever decision you make it for you. Not for Sarah, not for Mia, just for you. Because at the end of the day, you're the one who has to live with it. His words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, my decisions had always revolved around other people, my family, my responsibilities, my role as a husband and father. The idea of choosing something just for me felt foreign. Selfish, even. But maybe that's what I needed. Maybe that's what I'd been missing all along. I stayed at the bar longer than I meant to, talking with Chris about everything and nothing. When I finally left, the air outside was cold and sharp, but it felt good. Bracing. Like it was pulling me out of the fog I'd been trapped in. As I drove home, I realized that I still didn't have any answers. I didn't know what the future held, or if Sarah and I even had a future at all. But for the first time in days, I felt a tiny flicker of clarity, a sense that, no matter what happened next, I'd find a way to get through it. When I got home, the house was dark. Sarah must have already gone to bed, and for that, I was grateful. I wasn't ready to face her yet. Instead, I went back to the guest room and lay down, staring at the ceiling and letting the stillness wash over me. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for now, I was just glad to have made it through today. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps outside the guest room. For a second, I thought it was Sarah, but then I heard a gentle knock on the door. Dad? Are you in there? Mia's voice was small and hesitant, like she already knew something was wrong. I sat up, running a hand through my hair, and opened the door to see her standing there in her pajamas, clutching the stuffed bear she'd had since she was a toddler. Her big brown eyes, so much like Sarah's, looked up at me, filled with questions she didn't know how to ask. Morning, kiddo, I said, forcing a smile. What's up? She tilted her head, her expression serious in a way that didn't match her 9 years. Why are you sleeping in the guest room? Did you and Mom have a fight? I froze, unsure how to respond. Mia was too smart for her own good, she picked up on things even when Sarah and I tried our best to shield her. But how do you explain something like this to your kid? How do you tell her that the family she thought was solid is starting to crumble? I knelt down to her level, resting a hand on her shoulder. Mia, your mom and we're going through something right now. It's hard to explain, but I want you to know that none of this is your fault, okay? She frowned, her little face scrunching up in confusion. But, are you mad at her? Is she mad at you? I let out a heavy sigh, wishing I could protect her from this. It's complicated, I said, hating how vague I sounded. Sometimes grown-ups go through things that are hard to figure out. But I promise you, no matter what happens, your mom and I both love you more than anything." Her eyes searched mine, and I could see the fear in them. "Are you gonna leave?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to tell her no, that I'd never leave, that everything would be okay. But I couldn't make promises I wasn't sure I could keep. Instead, I pulled her into a hug, holding her tight. "I'm not going anywhere right now," I said softly. "I'm here for you, Mia. Always." She hugged me back, her little arms wrapping around my neck. "I don't want you and Mom to fight," she said, her voice muffled against my shoulder. "I just want us to be happy again." Her words broke something inside me. She was just a kid, too young to understand the complexities of what was happening, but her heart was in the right place. She just wanted her family to feel whole again. And for a moment, I felt a pang of guilt, wondering if I should fight harder for Sarah, for the sake of keeping our family together. But then I remembered the texts, the lies, the betrayal. I couldn't ignore the damage that had been done, no matter how much I wanted to shield Mia from it. If I stayed for the wrong reasons, it wouldn't make her happy, it would just create a new kind of tension, one she'd feel every day. "I know, sweetie," I said, pulling back to look at her. "And your mom and I are going to do our best to figure things out. It might take some time, but we'll always put you first. I promise." She nodded, though I could see the worry lingering in her eyes. "Okay," she said quietly. "Can we have pancakes for breakfast?" I smiled, grateful for the momentary shift back to something normal. "Pancakes sound perfect. You get the syrup, and I'll get the batter." As I watched her bounce off to the kitchen, her bear tucked under one arm, I felt a small sense of relief. Whatever happened with Sarah, I knew one thing for certain, would do everything in my power to make sure Mia felt loved and secure. She was my anchor, the one thing keeping me grounded in the middle of all this chaos. When I walked into the kitchen, Sarah was there, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She looked up as I entered, her expression a mix of exhaustion and sadness. For a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of unspoken words hanging between us. But then Mia ran in, breaking the tension with her cheerful chatter about syrup and sprinkles. I busied myself with making breakfast, letting Mia's excitement fill the silence. But even as we laughed and talked over pancakes, I couldn't ignore the way Sarah's eyes lingered on me, like she was searching for a sign that there was still hope. I wasn't ready to give her an answer, not yet. For now, all I could do was focus on Mia and take things one day at a time. The days that followed felt like walking a tightrope, every step precarious, every decision loaded with unspoken tension. Sarah and I barely spoke, navigating around each other like strangers in our own home. The space between us, both physical and emotional, was suffocating. Even when we were in the same room, it felt like we were worlds apart. I focused on keeping things normal for Mia. In the mornings, I made her breakfast and walked her to the bus stop. In the evenings, we did her homework together, played games, or watched her favorite shows. It was the one part of my day that felt steady, that reminded me of what was still good in my life. But every time I looked at her, I couldn't shake the guilt gnawing at the edges of my mind. No matter how hard I tried to protect her, she could sense that something wasn't right. Sarah tried to bridge the gap a few times, tentatively reaching out with small gestures, a cup of coffee left on the counter for me, a quiet, "How was your day?" when I came home from work. But I wasn't ready to meet her halfway. The betrayal still loomed too large, like a shadow over every interaction. One evening, after Mia had gone to bed, Sarah knocked on the door of the guest room. I was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, when she stepped inside. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "What is there to talk about, Sarah? You already said everything." She took a cautious step closer, her arms crossed over her chest. "I know I've hurt you, Roger. And I know I can't undo what I did. But I need to know where we stand. I need to know if there's any chance for us. Her words hung in the air, heavy and uncertain. I looked up at her, and for the first time in days, I really saw her, not the person who had betrayed me, but the woman I had built a life with. She looked worn down, her eyes red and tired, her shoulders slumped like she was carrying the weight of the world. And maybe she was. I don't know, Sarah, I admitted, my voice quiet but firm. I don't know if I can move past this. You broke something I don't know how to fix. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I know I did. And I hate myself for it. But I don't want to lose you, Roger. I don't want to lose us. I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. You should have thought about that before, Sarah. Before him. Before you decided our marriage wasn't enough for you. She flinched, the words hitting her like a physical blow. I know, she said softly. I know I don't deserve another chance. But I'm asking for one anyway. Not just for me, but for Mia. For us. Her mention of Mia hit me hard. I thought about our daughter, about the family we'd built together. Part of me wanted to believe that we could fix this, that we could find a way back to each other for her sake. But another part of me, the part still raw from the betrayal, wasn't sure if it was possible. I don't know if I can forgive you, Sarah, I said finally, my voice breaking. I don't know if I even want to try. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she nodded, her hands trembling. I understand, she whispered. But if you ever decide that you're willing to try, I'll be here. I'll wait as long as it takes. She turned and left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I sat there for a long time, staring at the closed door, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I wanted to believe her, to believe that she was truly sorry, that she could change. But trust isn't something you can rebuild overnight. It's something earned, something fragile. And right now, I didn't know if I could take that leap. As I lay down to sleep, I thought about Mia, about the life we'd built, and about the man I wanted to be, not just for her, but for myself. I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure, I couldn't stay in limbo forever. Sooner or later, I'd have to make a choice. The days blurred together after that conversation. I went through the motions of my life, trying to find some semblance of normalcy while the weight of everything pressed down on me. Work was a welcome distraction, giving me something to focus on that didn't remind me of the mess at home. But every time I came back to the house, the tension was there, thick and inescapable. Sarah tried to keep things civil, even light, but I wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine. We spoke only when necessary, mostly about Mia or the logistics of running a household. Anything deeper felt like stepping onto a minefield. I wasn't ready to hear her apologies again or her promises to make things right. I didn't even know if I believed her anymore. Mia was the only thing holding me together. Her laughter, her curiosity, her small moments of innocence, they reminded me that not everything in my life was broken. But even she started to notice the cracks. One evening, while I was helping her with her homework, she looked up at me with those wide, knowing eyes. "Dad," she said, her voice soft, "are you and Mom mad at each other?" I froze, caught off guard by her question. I had been so careful to shield her from the worst of it, but she was too perceptive for her own good. "We're not mad, sweetie," I said carefully. "Sometimes grown-ups have things they need to work through. But no matter what, you're Mom and I love you. That'll never change." She tilted her head, considering my words. "Does that mean you'll fix it? Whatever's wrong?" Her question lingered in the air, heavy with the kind of hope only a child could have. I forced a smile, ruffling her hair. "We're trying, Mia. We're trying." Later that night, after Mia was asleep, I found myself sitting in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't get her question out of my head. Did I even want to fix things? And if I did, was that even possible? I decided I needed an outlet, someone to talk to who wasn't directly involved in the situation. I called my brother, Dave. He'd always been the level-headed one, the person I turned to when life felt too overwhelming. When he picked up, his voice was warm, familiar. "Hey, man. What's up? Haven't heard from you in a bit." I hesitated for a moment, then blurted it out. "Sarah cheated on me." The line went quiet for a beat, and then he let out a low whistle. "Jesus, Roger. I don't even know what to say. Are you okay?" "Not really," I admitted. "I've been trying to keep it together for Mia, but it's a mess, Dave. I don't know what to do." He listened as I spilled everything, the texts, the confrontation, the awkward silence that had taken over our house. By the time I finished, I felt drained, like I'd poured out every ounce of energy I had left. "Look," Dave said after a long pause, "I can't tell you what to do. But I will say this, you deserve someone who respects you, who values what you bring to the table. If Sarah's willing to put in the work, and you think you can find a way to forgive her, then maybe it's worth a shot. But if you're only staying because of Mia, or because you're scared to let go, that's not fair to anyone. Especially you." His words hit me hard. I hadn't thought about it that way before, about what I deserved, or whether staying would do more harm than good. "Thanks, Dave," I said quietly. I needed to hear that. "Anytime," he said. "And hey, whatever you decide, I've got your back. Don't forget that." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of clarity, like I was finally starting to understand what I needed. I didn't have all the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't keep living in limbo. It was time to make a decision, one that wasn't about fear, or guilt, or obligation. It was time to figure out what I wanted, and what kind of life I wanted to build moving forward. The next morning, I woke up feeling a little different. Lighter, maybe, or at least less weighed down. Talking to Dave the night before had shifted something in me. It wasn't a magical fix, but it gave me a direction, a reminder that this wasn't just about Sarah or even Mia. It was about me, too. What did I want? What kind of life did I want to live? Those questions lingered in my mind as I got ready for the day. Sarah was in the kitchen when I came downstairs, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked up when she saw me, her expression cautious, like she was waiting for me to throw another verbal grenade. But I didn't. Instead, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her. "We need to talk," I said, my tone even but firm. Her eyes widened slightly, and she nodded, setting her mug down. "Okay." I took a deep breath, organizing my thoughts. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about wanting to fix things. And I need you to understand something, this isn't going to be easy. What you did broke something in me, in us, and I don't know if it can ever be fixed. But I'm willing to try. Not for you, not even for Mia, but for me. Because I need to know, one way or another, if there's anything left to save." Relief flooded her face, and tears filled her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I know I don't deserve it, but thank you. I'll do whatever it takes, Roger. I promise." "I'm not doing this for you," I reminded her, my voice sharper than I intended. "This is about figuring out what's best for me and Mia. If we're going to try, you need to understand that I need time, honesty, and a lot of effort from you. You can't just say the right things, you have to show me." She nodded quickly, wiping at her tears. "I understand. And I will. Whatever you need, I'll do it." I wasn't sure if I believed her, but it was a start. We talked for a while longer, setting some basic ground rules. I told her that I needed space, that I wasn't ready to move back into our bedroom yet, and that we'd need professional help if we were going to have any chance of moving forward. She agreed to all of it without hesitation, which I appreciated, though it didn't make me feel any better. Words were easy. It was her actions that would matter. Later that day, I made a call to a marriage counselor a coworker had recommended. It felt strange, admitting to a stranger that my marriage was in shambles, but the counselor's calm, reassuring tone helped. She scheduled us for a session later that week, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I was taking control of something. When I told Sarah about the appointment, she nodded enthusiastically. "I'll be there," she said. "Whatever it takes." Despite her eagerness, I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew as well as I did that counseling wouldn't magically fix everything. It would be uncomfortable, messy, and painful. But at least it was a step in the right direction, or at least a step toward figuring out whether there was still a path forward. That night, after Mia went to bed, I sat alone in the guest room, staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to call Dave again, to talk through everything, but I stopped myself. This was my journey, my decision, and I needed to find my own way through it. Instead, I opened my journal, something I hadn't touched in years. I started writing, about my anger, my confusion, my hope, and my fears. The words spilled out of me faster than I expected, and by the time I finished, I felt a little more grounded, a little more prepared for what lay ahead. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I was taking a step, maybe not toward forgiveness, but at least toward clarity. And for now, that was enough. The day of the counseling session arrived faster than I expected. I wasn't sure what to feel, nervous, skeptical, maybe even hopeful. It was hard to pin down. Sarah and I rode together in silence, the car filled with a tension that neither of us dared to break. She stared out the window the whole time, her hands gripping her bag like it was a lifeline. When we arrived, the counselor's office was small but inviting. There were soft chairs, calming artwork on the walls, and the faint smell of lavender in the air. It was the kind of place that tried to make you feel safe, even when everything inside you was screaming to run. The counselor, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Hargrove, greeted us warmly and motioned for us to sit down. Her demeanor was calm, almost too calm, like she'd seen every kind of marital disaster imaginable. I wondered what she thought of us, another couple trying to salvage something broken, or maybe just two people too scared to let go. Once we were seated, Dr. Hargrove started with the basics, asking us about our history, how we met, how long we'd been married, what had brought us to her office. I let Sarah do most of the talking, her voice trembling slightly as she recounted the story of us. She talked about how we'd met in college, how we'd built a life together, and how everything had started to unravel. And then I made a mistake, Sarah said, her voice breaking as she looked down at her hands. A terrible mistake. Dr. Hargrove nodded, her expression neutral. Can you tell me more about that, Sarah? What led to it? Sarah hesitated, glancing at me briefly before turning back to the counselor. I think I felt lost. Like I didn't matter anymore. Roger was always so focused on work and Mia, and I just felt invisible. Andrew made me feel seen. Her words stung, even though I'd heard them before. I clenched my fists in my lap, trying to keep my emotions in check. Dr. Hargrove noticed and turned her attention to me. Roger, how does that make you feel? I laughed bitterly, the sound harsher than I intended. How does it make me feel? It makes me feel like everything I've done, everything I've worked for, wasn't enough. Like I wasn't enough. I know I wasn't perfect, but I didn't deserve this. Mia didn't deserve this. Sarah's tears started to fall, and she wiped at them quickly, like she was ashamed to cry in front of me. I know, she said quietly. I know I hurt you. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I just want to try to fix this. If you'll let me. Dr. Hargrove stepped in before the tension could spiral. It's clear there's a lot of pain here, for both of you. But healing starts with understanding. Roger, can you tell Sarah what you need from her moving forward? What would rebuilding trust look like for you? I took a deep breath, trying to organize my thoughts. I need honesty, I said finally. No more secrets, no more lies. I need to know that you're committed to fixing this, not just for me, but for yourself. And I need time. I can't promise that I'll ever fully trust you again, but if I'm going to try, I need to see that you're willing to put in the work. Sarah nodded quickly, her tears still falling. I am. I'll do whatever it takes. Dr. Hargrove nodded, her expression encouraging. That's a good start. Trust takes time to rebuild, but it's not impossible. What's important is that both of you are honest about your feelings and your expectations. This won't be an easy process, but if you're both willing to commit to it, there's hope. The session ended on a cautiously optimistic note, but I wasn't sure how I felt. Part of me appreciated the structure, the guidance. Another part of me felt drained, like I'd just reopened wounds I wasn't ready to face. Sarah seemed equally exhausted as we walked back to the car, though she reached for my hand as we got in. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold on either. The drive home was just as quiet as the ride there, but something had shifted. The silence didn't feel as heavy, as oppressive. It felt more like a pause. A space to breathe, to process. Maybe, just maybe, it was the first step towards something better. Or at least, towards something new. The days after our first counseling session were strange. The house felt different, like the air had shifted slightly, though the weight of everything hadn't entirely lifted. Sarah kept her distance, which I appreciated. She didn't push, didn't pry, but her efforts were noticeable. She cleaned more, cooked meals I liked, and tried to engage with me in small, unobtrusive ways. It wasn't enough to fix anything, but it showed she was trying. That was something. Mia, on the other hand, seemed to sense the change. She didn't ask as many questions, didn't look at me with that same worried expression. Maybe the small changes in the house, the slightly lighter atmosphere, were enough to make her feel like things were getting better. For her sake, I hoped they were. But for me, it wasn't that simple. My emotions were still a mess. One minute, I felt cautiously optimistic, like maybe we could make this work. The next, I was drowning in anger and betrayal all over again. The mental back and forth was exhausting. One evening, after Mia had gone to bed, Sarah approached me cautiously. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through channels without really watching anything. She stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Can I sit with you?" she asked, her voice soft. I hesitated, but then nodded. She sat on the far end of the couch, leaving plenty of space between us. For a while, we just sat there in silence, the only sound coming from the low hum of the TV. It was almost peaceful, in a way, but the unspoken words between us hung in the air. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "I've been doing some reading," she said quietly. "About rebuilding trust, about affairs, and why they happen. I thought it might help me understand what I did and why I let it get that far." Her words caught me off guard. I looked at her, surprised. "And?" I asked, my tone neutral. She hesitated, like she wasn't sure if she should continue. I realized that a lot of it came from my own insecurities. Feeling unimportant, like I wasn't enough. But instead of talking to you, instead of trying to work through it, I took the easy way out. I let someone else make me feel better, and I betrayed you in the process. I know that's not an excuse, but I thought you should know. Her honesty was unexpected, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her that her actions had consequences she couldn't just explain away. But another part of me, the part that was tired of carrying so much anger, appreciated the effort she was making. "It's a start," I said finally. "But understanding why it happened doesn't erase what you did, Sarah. It doesn't make it hurt any less." "I know," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I don't expect it to. I want you to see that I'm trying. That I'm not taking this lightly. I nodded, my gaze drifting back to the TV. I see it, I said after a long pause. But it's going to take more than this. You know that, right? She nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I know. And I'm ready for that. The conversation ended there, but something about it stayed with me. For the first time, I felt like Sarah was really facing what she'd done, not just to me but to herself. It didn't make me forgive her, but it made me consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way forward. That night, as I lay in the guest room, I thought about the walls I'd built around myself. They were there to protect me, to keep the pain out, but they also kept everything else out: hope, connection, even the chance for healing. I wasn't ready to tear them down yet, but I started to wonder if, eventually, I might be. The next counseling session felt different, less like a trial and more like the start of something real. I wasn't ready to call it progress, but it felt like we were at least inching toward a place where I could see the possibility of healing. Sarah was more open this time, less defensive, and I found myself willing to let my guard down a little too, not much, just enough to participate honestly. Dr. Hargrove started the session by asking us both to reflect on the past week. What have you noticed about each other's actions? She asked. Have there been moments of connection, even small ones? Sarah spoke first, glancing at me nervously. I've noticed that Roger's been more present. Not just for Mia, but even in our conversations. He listens, even when I know this is hard for him. And that means a lot. I nodded slightly, acknowledging her words but not letting them sink too deep. Sarah's been making an effort, I admitted. She's been more honest. More intentional. I can see she's trying. That's a good starting point, Dr. Hargrove said, her calm voice encouraging. But effort is only part of the equation. What about vulnerability? Have you both been able to express how you truly feel, even when it's uncomfortable? I hesitated, glancing at Sarah. Vulnerability wasn't something I was good at, especially now. But if this process was going to mean anything, I knew I had to try. I'm still angry, I said finally, my voice steady but low. I'm angry at what she did, but also at myself for not seeing it sooner. I keep wondering if I could have done something to stop it, to prevent all of this. Sarah's head dropped, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Roger, it wasn't your fault, she said quietly. This was my mistake, my weakness. You didn't do anything wrong. Hearing her say it didn't erase the guilt I felt, but it did ease some of the weight on my chest. I looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I saw someone who was truly remorseful, not just for what she did to me, but for how she'd let herself down too. I appreciate you saying that, I said, my voice softer than I expected. But it doesn't change how hard this is. Every time I look at you, I think about him. About what you shared with him. And it feels like I'm carrying this poison inside me that I don't know how to get rid of. Sarah's tears spilled over, but she didn't look away. I know, she whispered. And I hate that I've done that to you. I hate that I've hurt you so much. If I could take it back, I would. Dr. Hargrove stepped in, her voice calm but firm. Acknowledging that pain is important, but so is finding ways to process it. Roger, have you thought about what it would take to let go of some of that anger? Not for Sarah's sake, but for your own. I shook my head. I don't know. It's become part of me now. Letting it go feels like letting her off the hook. It's not about letting her off the hook, Dr. Hargrove said. It's about freeing yourself. Holding on to anger can feel protective, but over time, it starts to hurt you more than anyone else. Her words stayed with me as the session ended and we drove home in silence. I wasn't sure if I was ready to let go of my anger, but I could feel the cracks starting to form in the arbor I'd built around myself. And that scared me. That night, after Mia went to bed, Sarah approached me again. Roger, she said quietly, can I ask you something? I looked up at her, nodding warily. What is it? If you could see us moving forward, even just a little, what would that look like to you? What would you need from me? Her question caught me off guard. I didn't have an easy answer, but after a long pause, I said, I'd need to know that you're in this for the long haul. That you're willing to face the hard stuff, even when it's uncomfortable. And I'd need time to rebuild trust, time to figure out if I can forgive you. She nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. I'll give you all the time you need, Roger. I promise. Her words felt genuine, but I knew promises were easy to make. The real test would be whether she could keep them. For now, though, it was enough. Just barely, but enough. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a small shift inside me, not forgiveness, not even acceptance, but the faintest glimmer of something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. It was fragile, barely there, but it was a start. It's strange how life doesn't stop to let you process. Bills still come in, Mia still needs help with school projects, and the laundry doesn't fold itself. The world keeps turning, even when yours feels like it's shattered. But somewhere along the way, I realized that the small, everyday moments, the ones that didn't demand anything from me, were where I found my footing again. Sarah and I continued with counseling, and while the sessions were painful, they were also eye-opening. We were forced to confront things we'd both avoided for years, her feelings of invisibility, my tendency to retreat into work, and the way we'd both let the foundation of our marriage crack without realizing it. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it gave me a clearer picture of why it had happened. That understanding didn't erase the hurt, but it made it less suffocating. One night, a few weeks after our second counseling session, Sarah knocked on the guest room door. She'd been doing that lately, knocking, waiting for permission to come in, respecting the boundaries I'd set. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Come in, I said, setting down the book I wasn't really reading. She walked in slowly, holding something in her hands. It was a small box, plain and unassuming. She sat down on the edge of the bed, placing it between us. What's this? I asked, eyeing it warily. She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling as she opened the box. Inside was a handwritten letter, folded neatly, and a photo of the three of us, me, Sarah, and Mia, at the lake years ago. Mia was about 5 in the picture, her smile wide and carefree as she sat between us. I wrote this for you, she said, her voice shaky. I didn't know how to say everything I wanted to in person, so I put it in here. I picked up the letter, my chest tightening as I unfolded it. Her handwriting was small and careful, the words pouring out of her in a way that felt raw and unfiltered. She wrote about her regret, her love for me, and her hope that we could one day find a way back to each other. But the part that hit me hardest was when she wrote about Mia. I know I've failed you, and I know I've failed her. But I want to do better, for her, for you, for us. If you're willing to try, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I deserve to be here. And if you're not, I'll still spend my life trying to be a better person, because you both deserve that much from me. When I finished reading, I set the letter down, unable to speak for a moment. My throat felt tight, and my chest ached, but there was something else too, something softer, something that felt like the faintest flicker of forgiveness. I don't know what to say, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. You don't have to say anything, Sarah said quickly. I just needed you to know how I feel. Whatever you decide, I'll accept it. I looked at her, and for the first time in weeks, I saw not just the woman who'd hurt me, but the woman I'd built a life with. The woman I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. She was flawed, broken in her own way, but she was also trying. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. I'm not ready to forgive you, I said finally, my voice steady. But I'm willing to keep trying. For Mia. For us. For me. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but this time, they weren't just tears of sadness, they were tears of relief, of hope. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for giving me a chance. That night, for the first time in months, I let her sit beside me, close enough to feel her warmth. It wasn't a grand gesture, and it didn't erase the past, but it was a step. And sometimes, that's all you can ask for. Life didn't magically get better after that. There were still hard days, moments when the anger flared up again, and nights when I doubted whether we could make it. But there were also small victories, moments of laughter with Mia, honest conversations with Sarah, and a growing sense that, no matter what happened, I would be okay. In the end, it wasn't about going back to who we were before. It was about figuring out who we could be now, with all the scars and lessons that came with it. And while the journey was far from over, for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were heading in the right direction.